Ethel once took a poke at editorial cartoonist Herblock, who had been critical of Bobby's authorization of wiretapping. Ethel was at a party when the cartoonist approached her, unaware of her anger. As he graciously extended his hand to her in friendship, Ethel planted her fist in his midsection, literally hauled off and slugged him in the stomach. If somebody crossed Bob, she put the black dot on your hand and she gave you the kiss of death. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and we're going to keep going in the other Mrs. Kennedy today. We're talking about Ethel and her complete and total Kennedy loyalty. And we're going to talk about a side of her personality that we haven't really seen yet. We saw a little bit of it in the end of last episode when she blew up on this person for wearing yellow shorts on her tennis court instead of tennis whites. The world's ending. And this was a woman who she had pressed into playing when she came over to Hickory Hill, and the woman said, "I'm not prepared to play," and Ethel said it was fine. But then when Ethel lost, she caused a scene at dinner and said, "Don't you ever show up on my tennis court in yellow shorts again." As though the woman had gone out there and, killed the family dog or something. Anyway, we've seen sort of the pettiness of Ethel's spirit, and we're going to see a lot of that today, because what we're talking about, amongst many, many things, is the fact that Ethel was loyal to Bobby to a fault, because things that he would blow off is not that big of a deal. If she saw that anybody criticized him in any way, she would make a scene about it, cut people out. She would recruit journalist friends of hers to write counter pieces to the pieces that were written about him. And really, there was a real problem with journalists at this time. Anybody who wanted to sort of be buddy-buddy with this new frontier administration found themselves needing to compromise the truth considerably. If you were invited to Hickory Hill, you were going to shut your mouth about what actually happened there, because if you didn't play by the rules, you weren't coming back. You weren't going to be in this fun inner circle, and everybody describes it as the place to be. It was fun, it was irreverent, it was unexpected. Everything that happened at Hickory Hill was just party, 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 and if you got invited there, you were really the cream of the crop. And so journalists were often invited because the Kennedys wanted lots of positive publicity, but you would not have been invited back if you had written what really happened or what troubles might have been in Paradise or Camelot. A lot of what we get from the Kennedy era is from journalists who were being mum about the realities because they wanted to go to the parties. And Ethel really drove the charge there. Now, we're going to cover a lot of other things as well. The Skakel family come back in for some hot drama in the first chapter we cover today. And so it's just another juicy episode, you guys. I cannot bring you a bad episode from this book, which I'm so thankful for. I mean, even the dull ones, I didn't think last episode was riveting, but it was still really good. That episode would have been one of my best episodes from a different book. So this episode's going to be fantastic. I don't know if we're going to get into the Monroe affair today. It just depends on how long I talk or whatnot. But we do get into the Monroe affair in this section. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting what Ethel may or may not have known. But if we don't get into it this episode, we will in the next episode. So stay tuned, because I know we all want to see what Jerry Oppenheimer has to say about Marilyn Monroe and the two Kennedy brothers. Anyway, this episode is riveting. Get yourself a snack. Get yourself a drink. Sit down. It's going to be good. Because the first episode is called A Question of Arson and Adultery. Okay. Sign me up, friends. I'm ready. Okay. Chapter 62 begins, by January 1962, Bobby was ranked as the second most powerful man in the Kennedy administration, and Ethel was considered the most popular and visible woman next to Jackie. Unlike previous attorney generals, Bobby had become involved in affairs of state far beyond his bailiwick. He had a say in almost every level of decision-making, from foreign policy to intelligence to the farm program. Jack trusted Bobby implicitly and credited him more than anyone else for helping win the White House. The president actually believed that the only people he could confide in, could seek advice from, could fully trust were members of his own family. Bobby topped the list. It was no surprise then that Jack gave Bobby and Ethel a plum assignment in early 1962. An unprecedented 14-nation, 28-day goodwill trip, a journey of presidential proportions. While the trip was billed as an informal tour with the emphasis on meeting young people, the host countries viewed Bobby and Ethel as they were meant to, as stand-ins for the President and First Lady, and they would be welcomed as such. Like began, Ethel was willing to leave her children behind for extended periods so that she could be with her husband. It was a hectic time for Ethel. With the trip looming, she had to pull together a new wardrobe and had assigned Madame Paul to come up with the designs. She also bought a brown wig at Elizabeth Arden's, knowing she'd have difficulty fitting in sessions with a hairdresser or finding Western hairstylists in Asia. From her circle of SS girls, she chose Susie Wilson, whom Bobby thought was cute, as her traveling companion. "I was there to give Ethel a hand," said Wilson later. "She always had to be dressed wonderfully, and I was there to say, 'What do you want to wear today?' or 'Let's close up these suitcases.'" At the same time, Ethel was busy planning an important Kennedy family charity fundraiser at the Washington premiere of Irving Berlin's new musical, Mr. President. In Palm Beach, her father-in-law, recovering from a serious stroke, expected her to fly down and pay homage to him. Moreover, Ted was being primed to run for the U.S. Senate seat for Massachusetts, once held by Jack. Ethel thrived on the action, the excitement, the pressure. But in the midst of all the frenzied activity, Ethel took a call on the morning of January 9th from Georgianne that left her completely undone. With increasing dread, Ethel listened silently as her sister recounted how the night before their brother George had been discovered with another woman in the guest house on their Greenwich estate by his wife Pat. There was nothing surprising about that. Ethel knew that Pat Corey and Skakel had confronted her husband's philandering before. Once, on the sidelines of the polo field in Greenwich, where George played on a team that he had named the Patricians after his wife, Pat Skakel caused a nasty scene by screaming, "Whore!" at one of his girlfriends in front of a shocked crowd of onlookers, and then raced off in a car that contained the woman's change of clothes. Georgianne herself had recently banned George from Sursum Corda after she returned home from Sunday Mass to find him and one of his girlfriends skinny dipping in the pool. Until now, though, the Skakel's marital difficulties, her drinking and his philandering, had never gone beyond screaming matches and accusations. But the ante had just gone up. Georgianne now told Ethel that the beautiful guest house where George had had his most recent frolic had been reduced to a charred shell, and all available evidence pointed to his enraged wife as the cause of the fire. Georgianne thought Ethel should know the story right away. Pale and shaken, Ethel hung up the phone. Again, a scandal within the Skakel family threatened embarrassment for the Kennedys. Ethel had no choice but to tell Bobby what had happened. She knew he'd want the matter kept under wraps at all costs. She went to church that day and prayed that everything would turn out okay. Sometimes I feel like Ethel's prayers are just such a Dear Santa list of things. It's like, why are you praying that everything goes okay? Maybe you should pray that it doesn't, because your brother is embroiled in affair after affair after affair and is hurting himself, other women, and his wife. What if you prayed that something happened to George so that he would come to his ever-loving senses? I mean, that's a harder prayer, but sometimes we need to pray that the bad happens so that the good can finally triumph. If you just pray for like another cover-up, is God in the business of being your Santa Claus? Is he your factotum? Is he your personal secretary? Is he your cover-up guy? Sometimes I think we approach God in that way, but I think let's pray for George. George is struggling. George has a hole in his heart, and that's why he's having all these ridiculous affairs and drinking too much. Also, let's pray for Pat. Pat's having a hard time. She just lit a house on fire because she found her husband philandering with yet one more woman. But okay, Ethel, you get on your knees and pray for yourself and all your personal needs for cover-ups. Anyway, earlier that morning, in an effort to contain the situation, George Skakel himself had taken matters into his own hands. He placed 2 telephone calls. The first was to Mary Begley's husband, John, a trusted friend who had once worked for Great Lakes Carbon. "We were in our pajamas and getting into bed when the phone rang," Mary Begley remembered. "All of a sudden, John was getting dressed, and I said, 'Where the hell are you going?' Smiling, he said, 'There's a problem with George, and I gotta help him out.' When John got home, he told me that George had a gal in the guest house, and John had to help him get the dame out because Pat was roaming around. John drove in through the Skakel's back driveway, picked her up, and took her home. He never told me who she was. This all happened before the fire started." As a side note, of one of many, sorry to say, as a side note, what would you think being married to a guy who was the fixer? Wouldn't that kind of gross you out? That your husband had just gotten up in the middle of the night out of your bed to go help some other man pull off his affair. Like, that would sicken me to the extreme. I feel like I wouldn't have any respect for my husband who did things like that. Because if you are willing to do that for another man, what are you willing to do in your own defense? Are you out there fooling around and getting, like, who is your fixer? Are you part of a hierarchy of fixers? Anyway, The second call Skakel made, around 2 a.m., was to his brother-in-law, George Terrian, a drinking buddy of Pat Skakel's. George Skakel was contemptuous of Terrian and often used him for dirty jobs. George told me Pat had discovered him with some broad in the guest house and Pat had burned down the place, Terrian said. George said, "Get your ass over here and take care of things. You know what to do." He wanted me to mollify the police and the firemen, and he wanted me to perform some kind of miracle. He wanted the whole thing covered up. He told me, "I don't need Ethel and Bobby crawling up my ass over this." And again, you have to ask yourself, what is the dirt on George Terrian? Or how desperate is he for the Skakel money that he could be called up out of his bed at 2 a.m. to come fix somebody else's problem? I cannot even convey to you the disdain and the anger I would feel over somebody calling me in the middle of the night to say, my guest house was just burned down because my wife found me having sex with another woman and she flew into a rage and burned the place down. So I'm going to need you to come and deal with the police. Why is that my problem, I ask you? By the time Terrian reached Vineyard Lane, more than 36 firemen were fighting the blaze in sub-freezing temperatures. The fire was calamitous. It destroyed thousands of feet of rare home movies of the Skakels dating back to the days in Chicago. Also burned was footage of Jack Kennedy's visit to Indochina when he was a congressman. The flames melted numerous equestrian and sports trophies won by Ethel, obliterated priceless pieces of art that had been lovingly collected by Big Ann. The house, reduced to a shell, had been a showplace with 2 immense bedrooms, a sauna, 2 baths, and a huge 2-story living room with a stone fireplace. Equipped with a pair of professional 35mm film projectors and a large screen that came down from the ceiling, the Skakels often viewed first-run features loaned to them by their close friends who were in the movie business. Everything was lost. Which, by the way, there's very few pictures of Big Ann, and I'm wondering if some of their photographs were also burned. There's only one picture I've ever seen, and it's really difficult to see exactly what her proportions are that gave her her due name. But there's nothing. There's really very few pictures of the family as well. So I don't know if those just never became public, or if maybe this fire also burned those up. But anyway, talk about a loss. While the fire burned out of control, George Terrian wandered around the periphery listening for talk about arson and looking for any incriminating evidence. In the bushes, I found a couple of pieces of women's clothing that the babe must have ditched when she left the place. I gave the stuff to George the next day, he said. I had to do whatever I could to keep the whole thing quiet. By the time the blaze was brought under control shortly before daybreak, 4 firemen had suffered minor injuries, and all that was left standing of the house were proportions of the 4 walls, a loss of more than $100,000. The rubble was still smoldering when Pat Skakel told the Terrians over drinks that she was responsible for the fire. Ethel must have called Georgie Ann and myself a dozen times that day to find out what was going on, said Terrian. She kept asking, "Did the police know what's happened? Did the police know who did it?" She was damn worried. She told me, "George, do whatever you have to do." Ethel also telephoned Pat and screamed and hollered at her. I went over to Pat's and she was crying and drinking and calling Ethel a bitch for worrying more about how all this would look for herself and Bobby than giving a damn about how badly her own brother was mistreating his wife by fooling around with other women. Mary Begley, who saw Pat Skakel immediately after the fire, said, "She was very willful, drinking heavily and acting very cavalier, giggling a little bit about it. She'd get a little smirk on her face and say, 'Now, wasn't that too bad about the fire?'" Jim Skakel arrived from his home in Bel Air to survey the scene. "It looked like Germany after the war," he said later. While Greenwich police and fire officials heard scuttlebutt and rumors of arson, no formal investigation was ever conducted. The nasty affair was completely put to rest when George Skakel decided not to file a claim with his insurance company. He didn't want any investigators nosing around because he knew Pat had started the goddamn fire and it would be highly embarrassing if she got arrested, said George Terrian. So George decided to cover the loss out of pocket. He told me, "I don't need to add insurance fraud to arson and adultery." Afterward, Ethel called Georgie Ann and expressed relief that George had decided to drop the matter. During the entire episode, Ethel was worried that the whole thing would get into the headlines. Luckily for Ethel, the national press once again ignored a scandalous episode involving the Skakels. In early February, she and Bobby took off on their successful world tour. Isn't that just a rip-roaring way to get today's episode? The next chapter is entitled Seducing the Press, and this is really where we see Ethel maneuvering. She was very manipulative, but she was just so silly and bubbly and, smiley. I mean, really, it's difficult to find a picture where Ethel isn't smiling. She always had a good face on. She definitely invited people into this effervescent world, and people wanted to go. I mean, it was a good time. Anybody would have wanted to go to these parties, quite honestly. But she knew that people wanted to come to her house and come to these parties, and she let you know that if you wanted to keep coming, you would only ever say nice things about the Kennedys. This is where we really see, I don't know, I was going to say this is where we really see journalism faltering. It's still quite in its heyday at this point, so I don't want to say, it was all terrible. But, nobody's got any good words to say about journalism now. There's been highs and lows in American journalism. Yellow journalism was obviously a time in which nobody bothered to tell the truth. But then we went through a season in which people were going to tell the truth. And I'm not saying that every word ever printed was always true and that there was a time when people cared about standards. But certainly there was a time when people cared about standards more than now. And unbiased journalism was seen almost as an American virtue. But I think this is a time in which we start to see people really putting their own personal interest ahead of the job that they did. And now it seems only personal interest that goes into journalism. But I really think this is the beginning parts of it. Tell me what you think. Ethel's fears that her family's wrangles would become public and cause embarrassment for the Kennedys were, for the most part, unwarranted. Many of Washington's most influential columnists, commentators, editors, and reporters had a gentleman's agreement with Jack and Bobby not to report awkward or prejudicial stories of a personal nature. Ben Bradlee, then chief of the Washington Bureau of Newsweek and later executive editor of the Washington Post, was a close friend of Jack's and had direct knowledge of the president's womanizing. In the same month that Pat Skakel had purportedly burned down the guest house because of her husband's adultery, Jack Kennedy had begun an affair in Washington with Bradlee's sister-in-law, Mary Mayer, a romance that blossomed in the Bradlees' carriage house and continued in the White House when Jackie was traveling. Yet Bradlee, lauded years later for overseeing the Washington Post's Watergate expose, agreed never to report anything he knew about Jack from their social connections. Ethel, meanwhile, was successful in controlling just about everything that was written about her in Hickory Hill. She was very careful. Anybody who talked was dead, declared Barbara Hauer. If Ethel wanted a story to get out, she put it out herself. You did not go out there and then talk about what you heard or saw, or you did not get invited back. Everything that went on at Hickory Hill was sacrosanct. Everything that went on at Hickory Hill was sacrosanct. She liked to have publicity when she was doing something with all the kids and the animals and her women friends. It was all a colorful smokescreen that kept Ethel herself from being scrutinized. In exchange for their discretion and loyalty, certain prominent journalists were given direct access to Bobby and Jack, and were on Ethel's exclusive party guest list. As Washington correspondent Douglas Kicker, who had worked for the New York Herald Tribune and NBC, noted later, if a bomb had ever gone off at Hickory Hill on a summer weekend, 3/4 of the most powerful print and broadcast journalists in America would have had to be replaced. It's never been a secret that relationships between reporters and their sources often become incestuous. But the situation at Hickory Hill between Ethel, Bobby, and the press was extreme. As a result, many of those people in their reporting wound up promoting the Kennedys and building false images and myths about them and became part of Kennedy history. As a result, many of those people in the reporting wound up promoting the Kennedys and building false images and myths about them that became part of Kennedy history and legend. For journalists, Hickory Hill was a seductive environment, a place where they rubbed shoulders with the best and the brightest. Hollywood celebrities, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, sports stars. Journalists sat by the pool and chatted with Bobby, played doubles with Ethel, tossed a football with Jack, drank the Kennedys' liquor, and ate the Kennedys' food. Hickory Hill was a place where you really wanted to be, said Barbara Gamerkian, who after leaving her press job at the Kennedy White House covered events at Hickory Hill for the New York Times. Hickory Hill rivaled any White House party. It was seductive to everyone, especially journalists, and Ethel always had the latest gossip. To stay on Ethel's good side, to continue being invited to the dinner parties, the barbecues, the intimate gatherings, all a reporter had to do was wave the Kennedy banner, be obedient and completely loyal. A lot of big-time journalists played by Ethel's rules and compromised themselves to be part of the circle, Douglas Kirker asserted. Writer Sophie Burnham, one of the few magazine journalists to secure a lengthy interview with Ethel over the years, recalled sitting with her by the pool at Hickory Hill one pleasant spring afternoon, participating in some media adulation that, inside, made me sick to my stomach. The Kennedys, she noted, quote, knew perfectly how to charm the press. There they were, Ben Bradlee, all those guys, being charmed by John Kennedy and Bobby. The adulation was shameful. Burnham, on the other hand, had come away from her chat with Ethel feeling horrified and speechless at some of the extreme views Ethel held on issues ranging from sports to sex. But the article generated more mail than Family Circle had ever received about one story. 50% thought Ethel was absolutely wonderful, Burnham noted. And 50% said she was the most shallow, stupid person they'd ever read about. The list of media biggies who were frequent guests at Hickory Hill and personal friends of Bobby and Ethel included NBC's David Brinkley, CBS's Roger Mudd, NBC's Dana Vanaker, Look Magazine's Warren Rogers, Life Magazine's Ann Chamberlain, The New York Times' Anthony Lewis, influential columnists Roland Evans, Joseph and Stuart Alsop, Joseph Kraft, Mary McRory, The Washington Post's Richard Hardwood, writer William Styron, humorist Art Buchwald, to name a few. The power, glitz, and glamour of the Kennedys were aphrodisiacs that few could resist. There were a lot of journalists who probably crossed the line with Bobby and Ethel in terms of friendship and socialization, said Vanaker later. The whole idea of journalists being close to politicians in Washington is nothing new. The funny thing about all that was that the people we worked for wanted us to have these connections. Nobody ever said stop. Ethel was a super good politician and public relations person, observed Richard Starnes, the Scripps Howard Washington correspondent assigned to cover the Kennedy administration's enforcement of desegregation at the University of Mississippi. For months, Starnes had tried unsuccessfully to do a profile on Bobby, but couldn't get past his press person, Ed Guthman. It wasn't until after Starnes wrote an especially positive story about how federal marshals under Bobby's direction handled the rioting on the Ole Miss campus that he received a personal invitation from Bobby to come to Hickory Hill to do an interview. Although Ethel met me only briefly the first time I was there, the next time I went, months and months later, she remembered me immediately. I had my then wife with me, and Ethel turned to her and said, "Dick wrote such a wonderful piece about Bobby." Ethel got my name right, and that impressed me. She knew what was important, and she came on as being very gracious and warm-hearted. Ethel's parties were amusing diversions filled with surprises, much like the ones her mother threw at Lake Avenue. Often she'd slip into the dining room just before dinner was served and rearrange the place cards, causing chaos by putting the wrong sets of people together. Guests were always expected to perform and participate, tell a story, sing a song, debut a subject. One couldn't slip in and out of Hickory Hill quietly. Now listen to this weirdness, okay? If everything we have read already doesn't already raise your eyebrows, this raises my eyebrows in a different way because it's just so completely clunky. The way Ethel was just digging around for a compliment in such an obvious way. It's not even like she was trying to shield it in any way. Listen to this party game she came up with. One of Ethel's curious dinner party games was dubbed, "I'll tell you one if you tell me one." The rules were simple. Ethel would compliment a guest for something he or she had recently done, written an interesting column, hosted a fascinating TV program, and then she'd expect a compliment about herself in return. Is that not the cringiest thing you've ever heard in your whole life? That is embarrassing to the hilt. And I can't believe that somebody with such clunky social manners could have become the toast of the town, but okay. Guests frequently were left feeling ill at ease because they couldn't think of anything Ethel had done to warrant a kudo. I was always embarrassed because she would say something nice about me, that one of her sister-in-laws had seen a show I did and they liked, and I could never come up with anything for her, recalled Roger Mudd. I always felt like a total dummy. Now let me just say this to Roger Mudd. Okay, well, maybe compliment her on the fantastic party she just gave. Maybe compliment her on something about her kids, her house, anything. Look around you, man. Compliment her on her taste and style. What woman doesn't want to hear that? Like, it wouldn't have been hard to come up with some kind of frivolous, stupid comment. But at the same time, if you know this is what she does, wouldn't you be like combing the landscape for a compliment so that you would have one tucked away the next time you came? If this happened to you more than once, that's on you, Roger Mudd. But at the same time, Ethel, are you for real right now? Be ashamed. Hickory Hill journalists were encouraged to bring their wives. Or their girlfriends. Everyone's secret was kept. But quite often the men were invited on their own by Ethel to play tennis with her, which caused some dissension and jealousy. Well, some of the women became chummy with Ethel, others found her shallow and vacuous. One, Polly Kraft, an artist who was married to political columnist Joseph Kraft, saw Hickory Hill as a terribly glamorous, exciting, irreverent, cheerful place full of hope. Ethel, however, was the absolute antithesis of what I am. She was either amazingly innocent, or naive, or maybe even square. Intellectually, she had no depth. On the other hand, Susie Wilson, wife of journalist Donald Wilson, bonded instantly with Ethel. The two had met by accident one afternoon in a parking lot in downtown Washington in the late 50s, as Ethel rushed her daughter Kathleen, who'd fallen off a horse, to the doctor. "Would you help me carry her?" Ethel asked Wilson. Isn't that the weirdest way to meet somebody? It is also weird to me that Ethel was the one bringing her daughter to the hospital. Maybe Ethel was on hand at the horse show or, where the child was practicing when she fell off the horse. But it's interesting to me that Ethel, who never seemed like she was really around the kids, was there when her daughter had fallen off her horse. I guess that's good. But what's weirder to me is that Ethel was by herself trying to take her daughter to the hospital and had to ask some stranger in the parking lot for help. That is a strange way to meet somebody. But anyway, while they waited around for the results of the x-rays, the two women chatted and Ethel's eyes lit up when she learned that Susie's husband was Life's Washington bureau chief. The next day, Ethel called and invited my husband and me to Hickory Hill for the afternoon to thank me for helping carry Kathleen up the stairs. If anybody had asked me why she actually called, I would have thought she was far more interested in Don and his position than in me. Following the lunch at Hickory Hill, the Wilsons and the Kennedys became new best friends, a relationship that was beneficial to both sides. Don Wilson got access to the Kennedys, and Life was able to do a number of exclusive and very positive features on Ethel, Bobby, and the children. Puff pieces, such as Ethel Kennedy and Her Children, Full Life of a Famous Wife, and Life Goes to the Christening of Bobby Kennedy's Son. Good baby, says Uncle Jack, among others. When Jack was elected president, Don Wilson was named Deputy Director of the United States Information Agency, and Sue Wilson accompanied Ethel and Bobby on a couple of major trips, including the Kennedy Triumphant Round-the-World journey in early 1962. I felt I got so much from knowing Ethel, Wilson said years later. She taught me a lot about love, a lot about faith, a lot about relationships. She was a very loving human being and very uncritical of people except for those who held different political views than the Kennedys did. Ethel wasn't Jackie in any way. Jackie was much more of the intellectual and the cultural maven. There wasn't much introspection with Ethel. She just never looked back. David Brinkley's wife, Anne, a writer, also forged close ties with Ethel and became part of her circle. But unlike Susie Wilson, who remained friends with Ethel for years, Anne Brinkley's friendship was ended by Ethel when the Brinkley's marriage of more than 20 years fell apart. Overnight, Ethel began inviting Brinkley's new girlfriend to Hickory Hill instead. Anne Brinkley was hurt and angered when she learned that one Mother's Day Ethel, David, and his girlfriend had a picnic at Hickory Hill using Anne Brinkley's picnic basket for their food. Okay, Anne, I don't think you're mad about the picnic basket. What? I think you're mad because your husband's taking his new girlfriend over to your old friend's house. But okay, it's a picnic basket if that's what you want to say. Ethel had decided that since I was no longer married to David, I was not worthy of her friendship. At first I was deeply hurt and puzzled. Later I was amused. Though I had been a devoted friend and helped on many Kennedy projects, Ethel cut me cold, she said. Okay, well, I'm sorry for Anne Brinkley. That sounds ridiculous. But, as we're going to read in the next chapter, this is kind of Ethel's way. She was a mean person. And this is sort of my theory about it. Ethel, by anybody's estimation, even the people who liked her, say that there really wasn't much to Ethel. She was just sort of silly. She was just sort of always wanted to have a good time, never introspective, could never look back. She didn't want to talk about anything that had any depth. If you wanted to talk to her about anything you'd read, it would need to be real gossipy and sort of salacious in order to draw her attention to it. And I think that for somebody like that who isn't interested in philosophy, isn't interested in religion, isn't interested in art, isn't interested in anything that would grow your mind in the conversation and in the discussion of the topics, those sorts of people have to make a mountain out of a molehill when it comes to tiny little, microaggressions or things that she feels like are unfair to her in any sense of the word. Because that's how they feel alive. For other people who are more intellectual, the things that really rivet them are deep conversations with other people, deep ideas, expressions of truth articulated in beautiful ways. But for Ethel, who didn't really care about any of that, how is she going to feel alive? By picking small fights about petty things. And that's how she gets her little zing. That's how she feels alive. She feels the fire of human emotion. By making a big deal and by making herself feel like she's really important, by being this tiny little troll in front of the bridge of the Kennedy house, that she's not going to let you pass to hurt the people that she loves. And that makes her feel really important, but what it ends up doing is making her seem incredibly petty. Because in this chapter, you'll find that she was often making trouble for people over things that Bobby didn't even think were a big deal. And I'm surprised that he wasn't more appalled by her behavior, considering the fact that he was so eager that his reputation be micromanaged, not wanting her relatives to reflect poorly on him, and yet his wife is out there literally punching people in the stomach when they don't do what she wants them to do. I mean, that's a legit story we're going to hear about. Okay, let's get into it. Chapter 64, Ethel's enemy list. When it came to dealing with the news media, Ethel's intense loyalty to Bobby manifested itself over and over in different ways. According to Gerald Tremblay, Ethel once took a poke at editorial cartoonist Herblock, who had been critical of Bobby's authorization of wiretapping. Years later, Herblock denied the incident ever happened. According to Tremblay, Ethel was at a party when the cartoonist approached her, unaware of her anger. As he graciously extended his hand to her in friendship, Ethel planted her fist in his midsection, literally hauled off and slugged him in the stomach. "When Ethel hits you, she hits you," said Gerald Tremblay, Ethel's escort at the party, who wasn't particularly shocked by her behavior. "No one could openly criticize Bob without Ethel getting mad," he said. "Bobby probably wouldn't have been as furious about that cartoon, but Ethel had a mind of her own. If somebody crossed Bob, she put the black dot on your hand and she gave you the kiss of death." Ethel was equally defensive of herself and other members of the Kennedy family. Once, a few days after a reporter wrote that she was, quote, "not noticeably adept at the Georgetown style and art small talk," Bobby slipped him a note warning him to stay out of her way. When Susan Sheehan of The New Yorker wrote a particularly hard-edged profile of Ethel for the New York Times Magazine, Ethel sent her an unusual 11-page handwritten letter on delicate pink stationery. Rather than responding to Sheehan's description of her as extravagant, competitive, and, quote, "an intellectual lightweight," among other things, Ethel chose to defend the Kennedy sisters, Jean, Pat, and Eunice, whom Sheehan described as too aggressive and masculine. Ethel's extreme loyalty did not escape the more perceptive journalists covering Washington. UPI's venerable Helen Thomas noted that Ethel's impulses are all positive and partisan. In her view, people are either for or against you. When it comes to the Kennedy family, she is a team player, as contrasted to her sister-in-law Jacqueline, who prefers solo flights. She has much more help politically than Jacqueline, and carries her load willingly for the party. Over the years, Ethel would repeatedly show herself ready to sever instantly long and close friendships with journalists if they wrote or reported something she perceived to be negative about Bobby or the other Kennedys. Among those blacklisted by Ethel from Hickory Hill were Joseph Kraft and Roger Mudd. A product of Columbia and the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, Kraft was fascinated by Bobby's take on issues and savored his wit. A year younger than Kraft, Bobby marveled at his political commentary and analysis, was delighted by his New Yorker pieces, and impressed by his clout as a nationally syndicated columnist. While Hickory Hill's main attraction for Kraft was Bobby, he also got a kick out of Ethel's irreverence and her uninhibited behavior. Though he didn't feel completely comfortable around her, he had problems relating to anyone who didn't know what lox and bagels were. He'd appreciated her as a friend. The Krafts became frequent dinner guests at Hickory Hill, and over the years, Kraft supported Bobby when he ran for senator, and later for president. When Bobby was killed, Kraft was devastated. He rode the funeral train from New York to Washington with Ethel, and served as one of the pallbearers. On June 7, 1973, a few days after the 5th anniversary of Bobby's death, Ethel turned to the op-ed page of the Washington Post, and saw a column by Kraft headlined, "Recollections of Robert Kennedy." Written at the time when the Nixon administration and the nation were paralyzed by Watergate, Kraft's piece was a poignant reminder of how much the country had lost with Bobby Kennedy's death. In an attempt at fairness, Kraft also mentioned some of Bobby's weaknesses as well. On Vietnam, the columnist said Bobby had, quote, "been a piano wire hawk." During his war on organized crime, he had, quote, "promoted wiretappings and other invasions of privacy." And a few of Bobby's supporters, quote, "would now defend the Southern judges he appointed as Attorney General on the theory that Senator James Eastland could be bought off." But the overall thrust of the column was positive and compassionate. His inclination was to tell the truth to others and himself, Kraft concluded. Stiff self-isolation was not in his being. So when he was wrong, he could adjust his position without making it seem, as more recent leaders have made it seem, that it would be the end of the world. Fiercely protective of Bobby's memory, blinded by her loyalty, Ethel saw none of the positive. Instead, she locked on to the few criticisms, like a heat-seeking missile, and slammed the door forever on her friendship with Kraft. She never called him to complain. He would not become aware of her fury until later. Instead, she raised the issue with her personal advisor, and Joe Kraft's longtime friend, Burke Marshall, who was now at Yale. The first volley in Ethel's campaign to blackmail Kraft came 2 weeks later. On June 22, 1973, the Washington Post printed a lengthy letter from Marshall denouncing Kraft's column headlined, "RFK defended on wiretapping and appointment of judges in the South." Marshall wrote. I know it is now fashionable in writing about Robert Kennedy to stress wiretapping and bad judicial appointments in the South, and not his public accomplishments. But this is inaccurate in the particular, and grossly unfair in the balance. Mr. Kraft especially should know better. Marshall then went on to shoot down each of Kraft's criticisms. Obviously, Burke wrote the letter at the instigation of Ethel, said Kraft's widow later. Joe is extremely hurt and bewildered. Joe felt his relationship with Burke predated any relationship he had with Ethel. Joe wrote Burke and said, "How could you have done this to me?" Joe's relationship with Burke was never repaired after that. At the same time, Ethel closed off communications with the Crafts and forced their mutual friends to take sides. There was a very quiet closing of the ranks around Ethel. The ranks being Art and Anne Bushwald, Liz and George Stevens, and my cousin Kay, Mrs. Roland Evans, Polly Craft said sadly. Nobody would ever talk about it. When they entertained and when Ethel came over, they just never invited us. We were absolutely blacklisted. I never had been aware that Ethel could be so vindictive. We didn't know that side of her. Ethel was on the warpath. On one occasion, she walked into a party at the Robert McNamara's, spotted the Crafts, and stormed out. By this time, Ben Bradley had become executive editor of the Washington Post. With his pal Jack Kennedy long dead, Bradley felt no strong allegiance to Ethel. In fact, according to Bradley watchers at the Post, he didn't particularly like Ethel and savored printing juicy gossip about her and the doings at Hickory Hill. You didn't invite Ben, his wife Sally, and Ethel to the same small dinner party, said a writer and observer of the Washington scene. In fact, Ben always kidded George Stevens about having his head halfway up Ethel's ass. I said, "Ben, that's the most horrible expression I ever heard." But he laughed and said, "Well, it's true." When someone leaked the McNamara party incident to the Post, it became the lead gossip item under the headline, "Not Forgotten, Nor Forgiven." The Boston Globe and other papers picked it up, further enraging Ethel. Not long after, Ethel walked out of another party, this time after checking the place cards and seeing the names Polly and Joe. Wasn't until later that she learned they weren't the Crafts. And just at the point when you're about to just be sickened by all things and just feel like, is anybody going to stand up to this little witch? It turns out that not everybody was, under her spell. The next act of her defiance against the Crafts was a clumsy attempt to bar Kraft from the prestigious RFK Journalism Awards luncheon that year. The awards were the brainchild of some of the reporters who covered Bobby's ill-fated presidential campaign, and the presentation of the prizes had become a prestigious affair, with hundreds of submissions from reporters and a big do at Hickory Hill. An opportunity, as the event brochure stated, to help forward the causes that Robert Kennedy believed in, worked for, and articulated so well. Mrs. Kennedy told the journalist to remove Kraft's name, revealed Ruth Dramstadter, who was the executive director of the awards program at the time. They said if you touch him, we're all walking out. They couldn't tolerate that she would take that kind of stand. Roger Mudd, an active member of the awards committee, said, "We responded to her as a board, that if she intended to exercise veto power over who we invited, we would resign." Ethel eventually backed off. A compromise was ultimately reached between Ethel and the journalist that allowed her to invite her own guests, but forbade her from vetoing Kraft or anyone else invited by the committee. Hurt and baffled by Ethel's actions, Joe Kraft opted to stay away from the luncheon. Ethel felt victorious. The first person who dared to have the Crafts and Ethel together at the same dinner party was Valerie Cook, wife of Newsweek reporter, who invited them on behalf of her guest of honor, former Nixon administration honcho Donald Rumsfeld. After the Crafts accepted, Cook telephoned Ethel, who agreed to come. "Just don't put us in the same room," she barked. Afterward, Kraft unexpectedly ran into Ethel at the Kennedy Library in Boston. "Oh, hi, kid," she said, caught by surprise. Kraft looked at her pleadingly, hoping to end their feud. "Come on, Ethel," he said, giving her a kiss on both cheeks. But she pulled away and rushed off. It was the last contact they had. Later, Polly Kraft took a hard look at what had happened. All Joe and I could say was that Ethel, in a sense, had done us a favor. It seemed ridiculous, but we seriously began to wonder whether those people who sided with her were actually afraid of her. Were they so insecure that they cared that much? It taught us that we could exist quite well without them. You go on, and it really matters almost not at all, except it hurts in the beginning because people won't talk. The other thing that hurt Joe was that he believed if Bob had been alive, none of this would have ever happened. He wouldn't have minded what Joe had written. He considered it a column about a man who was human. That's why he was so saddened by Ethel's reaction. But they weren't the only people who Ethel tried to plow under. Roger Mudd from CBS also had problems with Ethel. It says here that Roger Mudd had gotten to know Ethel while covering the Rackets Committee hearings as a young reporter for the CBS affiliate in Washington, WTOP-TV. After he joined CBS in 1961 as the network's Capitol Hill congressional correspondent, he and his wife got the first of many invitations to Hickory Hill. When the Mudds arrived at the front door, excited and nervous that first night, they were greeted by Ethel and one of her little boys. "This is Roger Maris?" the disappointed youngster asked his mother. Obviously expecting the Yankee slugger, Ethel shooed him away and introduced the Mudds to the other guests. Before long, the Mudds were among the regulars, and Roger became one of Ethel's Saturday morning tennis partners. "I don't know of any other couple, or any other circle in Washington since, that was comparable to that salon," he said later. "It was an electric mix, and the atmosphere was all so happy and jovial and a little scatterbrained. There was always so much going on, kids and dogs running in and out." Because of his friendship with Ethel, Mudd easily got Bobby's cooperation for a special, hour-long report on his presidential aspirations. It was a very difficult interview to do, because Bobby was not very communicative, Mudd said. None of the Kennedys were. They just didn't verbalize, and they did not like to talk about themselves because they thought that it was Jewish psychiatry. Despite Mudd's close relationship with Ethel, it took intense negotiations and lots of pleading before she agreed to sit for the camera, and in the end, she said little. After the Kennedys got a special viewing of the show at the CBS Washington Bureau, Bobby told Mudd he was pleased with the report. But Ethel wasn't. She was annoyed that Mudd had discussed the Kennedy family's enormous financial resources, even though he emphasized that Bobby and Ethel did not appear conscious of their money. Ethel's criticism of the program didn't change her friendship with Mudd. When Bobby was shot in 1968, it would be Mudd who pulled Ethel through the shrieking mob so that she could be at the side of her fallen husband. When one of Mudd's children was involved in a near-fatal accident in 1978, it would be Ethel who did everything she could to help the family. When Mudd needed a personal favor, a summer job for his son, it would be Ethel who arranged for the young man to work at Ted Kennedy's Senate office. That changed, though, in 1979, after CBS did an hour news special, this time on Ted Kennedy's presidential aspirations. Prior to agreeing to do the report, Mudd did a lot of soul-searching. "I had begun to see myself referred to in print as, quote, a friend of the family, which was never true. I was more of a friend of Ethel's than of the senator's. But I worried that if I did the report, critics would say, 'He hasn't come in with clean hands,' because of that friendship. I thought through it for a couple of days, and then I said, 'You bet I can do it.' Who knew as much about them as I did? I found I was personally strong enough to do what I was paid to do, which was to ask the right questions. I thought, Jesus, if I'm not, I better resign." A question more journalists should ponder. Anyway, Kennedy's people who considered Mudd a friend viewed his request as an opportunity to generate pre-campaign publicity for the senator. They'd recently turned down a request from Barbara Walters for an interview, even though she came to the table with the backing of his sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who promised, "It would be a good piece. We can check out the questions in advance." Mudd's program, entitled CBS Reports, Teddy, included a lengthy film interview with Kennedy at Squaw Island with tough questions about his role in the death of Mary Jo Kopechne at Chappaquiddick a decade earlier. As part of this story, CBS lashed a camera to the front fender of a car and dramatically drove the same route Kennedy had taken that night. Kennedy had claimed at the time that he hadn't realized he'd gone off the macadam surface and onto the dirt road that led to the water. But CBS's recreation contradicted him. The camera showed graphically how the car began bouncing when it hit the rougher surface. After watching the program, Kennedy felt he'd been had. "That son of a bitch ambushed me," he said. But Kennedy remained friendly and cordial with Mudd. Ethel, on the other hand, was beside herself. "She never told me she was pissed off, but I never got invited back to Hickory Hill again," said Mudd, laughing about the incident years later. By then, Roger Mudd was philosophical. "I didn't realize in the beginning that the reason I was welcome to Hickory Hill was not because I was scintillating or the best-looking guy, but because I was a prominent television journalist and I was supportive of the Kennedy family. I now regard Ethel as very single-minded, loyal to the point of almost frenzy. The minute I gave signs of not being on the team, I was off the team. I came to realize that it was a professional mistake to have gotten close to Ethel." Mudd subsequently ran into Polly Kraft at a party. "Well, now I know how you feel," he said. All right, we have one teeny tiny little chapter left to read, and unfortunately we won't get into the Marilyn Monroe stuff, but that just means we get to look forward to next episode. Anyway, let's read this last chapter entitled We Love Ethel, because it's about what happened when she went on her whirlwind tour across the globe in 1962 with Bobby, and how the world reacted to her, and how it changed her as a person. Not for the better. It says here, in chapter 65, entitled We Love Ethel, at the end of February 1962, Ethel and Bobby returned to Hickory Hill elated and victorious from their world tour. They'd been a hit. From Tokyo to Berlin, Hong Kong to Italy, the handsome young goodwill ambassador and his ebullient wife had been greeted like royalty by adoring throngs. For Ethel, who was born to shop, a good part of her activity on the trip was spent buying things. Silk and brocade yard goods in the Far East, a joke gift of sexy apparel from the House of Dior in Paris for Jack and Jackie to wear. It's so silly, I just can't stand it. She also brought home gifts bestowed upon her by foreign dignitaries for her children. Ethel's favorite was an Indonesian stuffed tiger, almost as big as a sofa and so fierce and spooky looking it's just unbelievable. Hearing that Bobby Jr. liked animals, the Indonesians also presented Ethel with a 3-foot-long stuffed lizard. There were also Berlin bears for the boys and dolls for the girls from Germany. The trip, which cost the taxpayers a modest $15,000, had been a mixture of pure statesmanship on Bobby's part and vintage I Love Lucy on Ethel's. In Rome, where she and Bobby had a private audience with the Pope, Ethel was involved in a zany traffic accident. She'd been window shopping, followed by a coterie of reporters, when she fell in love with a bright green Vespa motor scooter in a showroom. Not long after, while having a bite in the Tuscan restaurant on the Piazza Fontanella Borghese, Ethel was surprised when the press corps showed up with a scooter as a gift because she'd been such a, quote, swell sport throughout the trip. Ethel, who'd never ridden a scooter, started the motor in the restaurant, which caused an Englishwoman sitting nearby to suggest, "What a charming idea, really, but wouldn't it be easier to ride outside?" Ethel then hopped on the Vespa, maneuvered out the door, and zipped into Rome's insane traffic, to the cheers of Italian bystanders. Moments later, she promptly crashed into a car. Knocked to the ground, Ethel scrambled to her feet, smiling despite a bruised leg. "I just couldn't find the brakes," she apologized. A policeman who witnessed the fender bender said Mrs. Kennedy failed to slow down. But the matter was quickly settled and no charges were pressed because one of Ethel's escorts pulled out a wad of cash and paid off the other driver for whatever minor damage and inconvenience he had suffered. A few days later, reporters on the tour presented her with an orange crash helmet emblazoned with the words, "Crash Kennedy." In Honolulu, Ethel got dunked in the harbor 100 yards offshore when the Navy boat that she, Bobby, and Susie Wilson had borrowed for a quick sail suddenly capsized in high wind and choppy waters. Ethel wanted to swim back, and I said, "Are you nuts? I'm staying right here with the boat." I learned life-saving 101, but she was ready to make a swim for it, said Wilson later. Luckily, 2 Navy pilots water skiing nearby spotted their bobbing heads, directed their motorboat to the scene, and asked if they could use a lift. "We sure could," Ethel said. In Berlin, at the German-American Community School, Ethel urged a group of 3rd graders not to be discouraged if they did not always do well at their lessons. "After all, Bobby had to repeat 3rd grade," she said brightly, a fact that had never appeared in any of the history books. Ethel's revelation embarrassed and annoyed the Attorney General. Isn't it interesting that Ethel, who could not stand it if anybody said anything even vaguely critical of her husband, would present a fact like that was sure to embarrass him? Because, all the Kennedys are supposed to be these brilliant people who would never have had to repeat a grade. And then she's over there just spilling the family secrets. And it makes you wonder if the reason that she went after other people so aggressively was as a cover for when she made mistakes regarding what she said to the press about Bobby. So if she could really highlight everybody else's mistakes and make a big to-do about that, then Bobby might not see her faux pas as being as big a deal. Because one, he could clearly see that she was on his side after her going over so aggressively to other people, but she could also point the finger and say, what they did was worse than what I did. Anyway, in Tokyo, during a visit to the University of the Sacred Heart, whose superior had been a teacher in Manhattanville, Ethel delivered a speech that veered toward the Twilight Zone. And really, what the problem with the speech was, is that it didn't make any sense. To quote the speech, she says, "I always thought that the United States was more liberal than this country, but it's not true. At Manhattanville in my day, we were very virtuous. I understand now that you are allowed to get married." What? The reporter for the journal American wrote that her train of thought was a bit hard to follow. I don't even know what she's trying to say. At the Zen Buddhist temple of the Green Pines, where a Japanese politician had arranged for a 3-hour, 13-course lunch, Ethel began to weary of the traditional kneeling position. She turned to a Japanese woman at the luncheon. Are your legs getting tired? When the woman responded politely, No, or yours? Ethel said firmly, I can do it as long as you can. The rest of the time, she spent shopping at Mitsukoshi Department Store, where she stocked up like a typical American tourist on battery-powered toy animals, a toy train that whistled and blew smoke and made a lot of noise, kimono-clad dolls, wooden clogs, bamboo baskets, chopsticks, and a china-ware sake set for Bobby. Then she rode the subway back to the U.S. Embassy. Later, she was a special guest in a popular Japanese TV show called What's My Secret. Ethel's ego was bursting out of control when she got home, recalled a friend. She began believing her own reviews. After that trip, she really did think she had more going for herself than Jackie. She was saying, Can you believe this? Little me from Manhattanville, little Ethel Skakel, who would have ever thought? She said, My God, they treated me like a queen. My God, the world loves Bobby. We should be in the White House. We will be in the White House. Well, we can dream, can't we? I think Bobby probably would have made it to the White House for sure, had he not been assassinated, which is really horrible. And I'm really wondering what's going to happen to Ethel when he's assassinated. Her whole life hung on his being. It's almost as though she was animated by his spirit. And I think that for anybody to have their spouse assassinated, it would be a hellacious trial, second to nothing else that could ever be thrown to you. Losing your spouse, but then in such a horrific and unfair way, such a violent way, would be unbearable. But I just don't know what somebody like Ethel could have made of that situation. What was her life but for her husband? And I can understand why in the years afterwards, she really just dedicated her life to his memory. Because if he wasn't going to be somebody that she could live with in reality, she was going to live with in memory. So I feel very sad for her in that way. But I also think that she hadn't done much in her life to create an existence separate from him. I mean, I'm sure she never anticipated that he would be assassinated, so I'm not saying that she should have been living life with the anticipation of an assassination. But it does seem that she should have had something more to herself than to just live on his arm as this person who was basically his little hype girl. And I just wonder, because she lacked introspection, I don't know if she ever considered that she was a separate entity from him and that she should be something more than just his little cheerleader. At the same time, I'm sure that she also came from a time and a place, and definitely her education would have supported this, that her role was in subordination to him in every respect, and that the way that might look is by defending him at all costs to everyone. So, maybe I look at Ethel and I just think, what in the world, girl? Like, why are you getting so hot and infuriated and if anybody gave your husband the side eye? But then maybe she just thought that's what love looked like. Certainly that's the way she'd seen her mother love her father. So what else was she supposed to do? That's what it looked like. Although I think that she was much more subservient to her husband than Big Ann was to hers. I mean, George kind of like let Anne have her way in all things. But Anne did live her life based on what her husband was doing and always made sure that she could be with him and would go on long trips to be with him. So I'm sure that for Ethel, being a loving spouse meant that everything came second to that person. And I do think that generally that is true. I think that generally being a loving spouse means that you are their cheerleader, that you do look to build up their image in other people's minds, and you wouldn't stand around and tear down your spouse. Those are good qualities to have. I'm not saying that Ethel was this sad, beaten down woman because, she loved her man. I don't mean that at all. I just mean, I think that Ethel became delusional in her frenzy to defend him, even when nobody had done or said anything that was worthy of that kind of anxiety and angst and disdain. And even though nobody had ever done anything that required her to leap up in indignation and, go punch somebody in the stomach. I mean, that's not the way people behave. So, I don't know. She's a complicated little character, even though she is, as so many people said, not exactly an intellectual heavyweight. She's just a strange little person. And certainly has no equals. She is a party unto herself as far as the way she behaved to the world. Anyway, next episode is going to be exceedingly interesting because the first chapter we're getting into is called The Monroe Affair. I really cannot wait to see what Oppenheimer has to say about that. Because so far he has just brought it, as I've said many times, and I know we're all enjoying it. And I'm going to be really sad when this book is over, quite frankly, because I have enjoyed every single word of it, and I know you guys have too. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thanks again for hanging out, and thanks again for all your comments and your enjoyment of the book, and see you soon.